This is the Lower Manhattan Expressway, or at least it almost was, and thank God for that, as this project almost became the epitome of what America stands for: terrible design. Basically, this expressway would have torn through the heart of America's largest city with a 10-lane elevated highway at the cost of the surrounding neighborhoods. Thankfully, activists like Jane Jacobs fought the project for years, writing the influential book The Life and Death of American Cities, and thankfully this horrible idea was abandoned. But while Manhattan escaped the worst of mid-century urban planning, other cities around the United States weren't so lucky. Today, nearly 70 years after the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 set out to build the country's system of interstate highways, much of the country is unrecognizable. And the result is just one of the many ways, yes, many ways, that America is terribly designed. The federal highway system is likely the most expensive infrastructure project in American history, costing $571 billion so far and adding nearly 50,000 miles or 80,000 kilometers of roads over 2 decades. The system has made it easier and cheaper for goods to travel across the country for people to get to work or travel to other places they want to go, which is great, but the collateral damage of this massive project was that over 1 million people were displaced by the construction. The idea was to clear slums, but the result was evicting minority residents and enforcing segregation that could no longer be upheld by previous laws. See, the Federal Housing Administration helped to subsidize building new housing for decades, but required that no African Americans be allowed to live there. At the same time, the US government created maps of the entire country for banks which marked African American neighborhoods as red to show they were too risky to insure mortgages, which is absolutely mind-boggling to me. And that's not even all, as after World War II, the Veterans Association financed mortgages for soldiers, but these mortgages followed the same racial segregation requirements, meaning they excluded African Americans from benefiting because the neighborhoods they were allowed to live in were redlined. Today, explicit institutional discrimination has been removed, but this development model has created new problems. Of the 138 million homes in the US in 2018, 68% were single-family houses. Thanks to single-family zoning, that means many neighborhoods are entirely made up of only houses, no apartment buildings or even small businesses that you can walk to. Of course, there are older neighborhoods in the US where it is possible to walk to the store, but it's far from the norm outside of city centers. It's simply an undeniable fact that modern-day America is a country built for cars, not people. Further illustrating this point is parking lots. Oh boy, don't get me started on Americans and their parking lots. Over 5% of the entire country is covered in parking lots, leaving 8 parking spaces, yes, 8 parking spaces for each car in the United States. How in the world does that make sense? I have no clue, but it's the truth. America's downtowns are full of parking lots that took the place of irreplaceable historic buildings, leaving an urban landscape that looks like a smile with missing teeth. To make matters worse, Donald Shoup, author of The High Cost of Free Parking, estimates that 99% of parking in the US is free, which might sound like a great thing, but it drives up the cost of housing and goods. And even outside of dense downtowns, buildings across the United States have, quote, minimum parking requirements, which gobble up valuable real estate and give it to the automobile. Just to give a bit of a reference, in the city I live in, for example, Copenhagen, we're removing parking lots and roads to make it more walkable and enjoyable to live here. But honestly, I wouldn't be too mad at the US for having their highways if they could just maintain them properly. See, today, America's roads, bridges, and other infrastructure is in a terrible state, as 10% of bridges are considered structurally deficient and 14% functionally obsolete. Just listen to that statement again. 14% of America's bridges are, quote, functionally obsolete. That's ridiculous. But anyway, while the United States could once build infrastructure megaprojects on a national scale, like the first intercontinental railroad that was completed in 1869 or the interstate highway system a century later, the country seems to have a hard time implementing technologies like high-speed rail that other countries figured out half a century ago. The Aquila train, which I have now learned how to pronounce, thank you YouTube commenters, your criticism is very much appreciated, But anyway, the Aquila train running from Boston to Washington DC is honestly a good start, but it can only achieve its top speed of 150 miles an hour over a short 34-mile portion of the track between Rhode Island and Massachusetts due to antiquated infrastructure and sharing the tracks with other slower passenger and freight trains. And in California, the California High-Speed Rail project is way over budget and is projected to run only between Bakersfield and Merced by 2029 after the Brightline West train from Los Angeles to Las Vegas is projected to be complete. Still, the fact that America is building multiple high-speed rail projects is encouraging, and if we take probably the US's biggest advantage into consideration, being the world's largest economy, it has the option of throwing money at the problem. And they're doing exactly that. See, the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill provides $1.2 trillion to fix many of the problems with the country's aging infrastructure while funding clean energy and climate-friendly transportation, which is great, but there's a lot of work to do. In its most recent report card, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave America's infrastructure a C- and transit got a D-, which is not surprising when you consider 45% of Americans have zero access to transit and only 14 American cities have a metro system. What's telling is that in Los Angeles, America's second largest city, only 6% of residents use public transport. The craziest thing, however, is that it hasn't always been this way. Before World War II, extensive networks of trams, which Americans call trolleys or streetcars, were in most cities. The decline of these systems started with competition from cars and buses, but some of these original systems still survive in a few cities like New Orleans and San Francisco. In recent decades, modern trams have been reintroduced to cities like Portland and Washington, DC. While this is encouraging, if you don't live in a major city, you're unlikely to ever benefit from these improvements though. But I think it's finally time to discuss the horrible design of America's political system. While revolutionary at the time it was created, it has some striking flaws when compared to other democracies. See, every 10 years, the United States counts how many people live in each state. Based on this count, the states have to change the voting districts so that each district has roughly the same number of people. But some politicians redraw these districts to help their own party win more elections. They might make weirdly shaped districts that group together people who are likely to vote for their party and spread out people who are likely to vote for the other party. This is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering can make it harder for people's votes to count and can give an unfair advantage to one party over the other. Take for example the state of Texas. In the most recent redistricting, the 33rd district gives Democrats a 44-point advantage while it wraps around 4 heavily Republican districts. The redistricting in Texas was so bad in fact that the Biden administration sued Texas over it, but the Supreme Court rejected the challenge to the new map in November, so it remains. The result is 12 more Republican-leaning seats in the state. Basically, the redistricting laws can make it impossible for the opposing party to win in different districts, which isn't a good thing. After the 2022 redistricting of federal voting districts, which determined US Senate seats and presidential elections, the entire United States now has 188 strong Democrat-leaning districts, 168 Republican ones, and only 79 which are considered competitive. US federal elections use a plurality election system, meaning the candidate which gets the highest percentage of votes wins. This is also called a winner-takes-all system. In comparison, the EU Parliament uses a proportional voting system, which gives seats to any candidate that wins more than 5% of the vote. This is great for giving a voice to smaller parties which would have no chance in a plurality system. But let's now talk about the other major flaw of the US election system. Yes, the Electoral College. Basically, the president isn't directly elected by the people, but by a group of representatives called the Electoral College. When America's democracy was first founded, the idea was a compromise between letting Congress or the people choose the president. But it seems insane to use this weird proxy when you could just let citizens directly choose their leader instead. The consequences of keeping this system are real. Donald Trump had nearly 3 million votes less than Hillary Clinton in 2016, but but was able to win because he had 74 more electoral votes. Another thing that doesn't really make sense to me is how the US has structured their education system. While things like healthcare, safety, and education are seen as human rights in other countries, Americans have to pay up. The cost of a university education at a public university has grown 175% over 20 years, drowning young people in debt that they could have used for maybe a home if they lived in a country with cheaper education. The average in-state university costs $10,200 per year for a 4-year bachelor's program, but depending on the state and whether you're at a private or a public university, the cost can be as much as $50,000 per year. On the other hand, German students pay around 250 euros per semester in administrative fees, although private universities can have American-style price tags. And in Denmark, you get paid around $1,000 per month just to study. But back to the US. Another thing I don't really get about the US's design is their state structure, because even though all states technically fall under the same country, well, they do, there is a stark divide between states in terms of the level of development and standard of living. For example, Connecticut, the wealthiest state, and Mississippi, the poorest, have major gaps in life expectancy, college attainment, income, and other factors. To put that into perspective, Connecticut, a state of 3.6 million people, has a GDP per capita of $89,301 in Q3 of 2022, close to Norway's $88,750. Mississippi, with 2.9 million people, had a per capita GDP of $47,500, which is slightly below Germany's. Both would be considered wealthy countries, but Connecticut is nearly twice as well off. In a country as large as the United States, each state is like a country in itself with its own unique laws. What's bizarre to me as a foreigner is that laws can vary from one state to another. If you drive across the river from East St. Louis, Illinois to St. Louis, Missouri, suddenly it's illegal to turn right on a red light. Like, why would you have different traffic laws in different states? Doesn't that just unnecessarily confuse things, or is that just me? I mean, another great example is that you can legally possess cannabis in Bristol, Virginia, but if you literally just cross the street to Bristol, Tennessee, it's illegal. And tax loopholes exist too, because in Tennessee you don't pay state income tax, and in Delaware you don't pay sales tax. It's honestly baffling to me how this can be possible within the same country. This isn't to say that America is a terrible place to live, or even that it's a bad place. This is just a snapshot of the current situation that they're in right now, and also just my opinions. Although that's it for this video, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.